Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Our webinar titled Controlling Listeria, Considerations and Risks in Sampling and Testing. So today we're going to look at challenges facing all food processors as they look to build an adequate Listeria control plan, leaving plenty of time to answer any questions you may have at the end. So first, I'd like to start by reading a brief introduction of our distinguished presenter, Dr. Douglas Marshall. Doug Marshall is the Chief Scientific Officer with Eurofins Microbiology Laboratories. He is also co-founder and director of the Food Safety Institute, technical director for the Refrigerated Foods Association, and microbiology task force chair for the American Spice Trade Association. Doug has had an extensive teaching career, most recently as Associate Dean and Professor of Public Health at the University of Northern Colorado. He continues to share his knowledge and expertise through over 300 invited presentations and over 100 workshops delivered, as well as a frequent volunteer and consultant to trade organizations, government agencies, and private companies. So with that, Doug, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to you, and I'll let you begin the conversation.
Thank you very much, Scott. Pleasure to be here with everyone. The talk today is a little different than some of the other Listeria control talks that I've given over the years. All of those are available on the website. Today, I'm going to do a little bit deeper dive into testing considerations. So rather than spend a lot of time on some best practices for a Listeria control plan, I'm really going to focus on some of the things that go wrong in testing and how that can influence your plan, but also influence the risk that you're taking with your current testing protocols. So hopefully this will provide you with some new information that you haven't already seen in some of our other webinars. Excuse me. So as you know, Listeria is a common environmental contaminant that can get into ready-to-eat food somewhere during the process. So usually we focus on areas of control after a kill step, if you have a microbial kill step in your process. If you don't, but you're still making a ready-to-eat food, then the entire facility might be part of your environmental monitoring plan. And so the whole purpose of doing environmental monitoring is to be able to verify whether your sanitation program is working, to be able to verify whether your GMPs are working, and maybe to consider whether or not your ingredients might be a source of Listeria. So testing a finished product is a verification activity because it's the ultimate arbiter of the success of your Listeria control plan, but it should be performed in addition to environmental monitoring. As you're aware, Listeria is a teeny tiny microorganism, so it's very difficult to find these organisms in the environment or in products. So we have some quite sophisticated schemes to be able to find very low populations of very small microorganisms in foods and in the environment. So when you think about how small it is, it's teeny tiny, micrometers in length. And remember too that 1 gram of fecal material, which is about the size of the nail on your pinky, can contain up to 10 billion bacteria. So, we've got these microbes all over the place, but in most food manufacturing plants, Listeria and or Listeria monocytogenes is a small proportion of that overall population. So some questions a good plan asks as you're building it and as you are validating it and as you're doing verification testing to make sure that it's working are the next couple of questions. Why are you sampling? What is your goal to sample either product or your environment for Listeria? And then when you get results back, what are you going to do with those results? So we always advocate trending those results, whether it's Listeria testing, mono testing, or indicator testing such as ATP, microbial indicators, because oftentimes those will give you some advance warning when your processes are trending out of control. So you need to establish effective alert and action levels and then use those trends to help you do investigations so that you prevent contamination rather than react to contamination. And then your corrective actions need to be implemented in response to these out of specification trends. Another question that's pretty common is, when do I sample and why am I sampling? So depending on the experts that you are using to build your plan, certainly FDA has their Listeria controls guidance document. Some of the issues with that guidance document is it was written to be able to accommodate most kinds of foods and most kinds of processes, but there are some things in there that can trip you up. We're not going to go into those details, but hopefully you'll see some of these examples as we go along today. So for pre-op, it's after cleaning and before sanitation. Here you're trying to verify the surfaces are clean because you can't sanitize dirty surfaces. Your first shift, so then you may want to do a pre-op after sanitation. The FDA guidance document says, 3 to 4 hours into production. If you're a fresh produce manufacturer with no kill step, I'm not sure what those data are going to tell you, other than you got Listeria in product coming in. You probably have Listeria on equipment. So the why then on the first shift testing is to verify that your sanitation is working and that your GMPs are effective. You run a second shift, then you might want to test prior to cleanup. So here you're looking at testing a very dirty environment. And again, it might suggest that you've got embedded Listeria that's defeating your sanitation and could potentially be shed into product during manufacture. And then the last when to sample and why would be for investigations. Here again, you're trying to identify harborage sites of Listeria in the manufacturing environment that is escaping your cleaning and sanitation activities. Testing frequency. It's a question I get all the time from our customers is, how often should I be testing? And the answer is, it depends. And why does it depend? Because we have to consider the history and trends of the facility. We have to consider history and trends of like products manufactured by others. Does the industry sector have problems with Listeria control? If the answer is yes, then those problems might in fact be also prevalent in your facility. We need to look at the features of the facility. Is it a brand new plant built to sanitary design? You have nice equipment that's easy to disassemble and clean and sanitize, or you're working in an antiquated facility with lots of physical plant defects, with equipment that may be impossible to clean and sanitize. So again, that's quite a range of possibilities, and that's why frequency is going to be determined based on the features of the facility. Your types of product and the volume manufactured, what brand are you trying to protect? If you're a co-manufacturer, you may not be brand sensitive. If you're a brand owner, you probably are brand sensitive. The plant layout, product flow, and how much risk you are willing to accept to run your business. So let's think about risk in a little bit more detail here. So I would put the following characteristics in a higher risk bucket, if you will. So if you're making a ready-to-eat product that supports growth of Listeria and or Listeria monocytogenes, then I would think you are a high-risk food manufacturer. If that food product is going to a high-risk consumer, then maybe that moves you up into the greatest risk profile. Again, history of outbreaks and recalls with like products. You have a well-respected brand that you choose to protect. Here's one that's a little interesting. Are you under pressure to reduce costs by doing fewer tests and doing the testing less frequency? If so, then you are willing to accept the risk of a large recall size. Are you under regulatory scrutiny? If so, the regulators are there for a reason. There may be an outbreak that they're trying to find who the offending party is. There may be an outbreak associated with a product that is a like product made by somebody else, but the regulators may not know who the offending manufacturer is, so they're going to be looking at everybody in the space. Let's contrast that with a manufacturing environment that might be lower risk. So you're not making a ready-to-eat product. So the assumption is that the consumer, either directly or through a food service operator, uh, will cook your product prior to consumption. And that cook process hopefully is a kill step. So you might ask the question, if I'm making a frozen, ready to eat, not ready to eat product that requires cooking by the consumer, is the consumer um, able to accomplish that kill step every time they cook your product? Right? So is there an opportunity for abuse and what that risk is? You might be making a ready to eat product that doesn't support the growth of Listeria. And historically, for dozens of years, uh, experts in the space said, well, that's a fairly low risk opportunity because if the organism doesn't grow, it may not reach a population size that's at the infectious dose. So we have a couple of examples here where manufacturers might have made that hazard assessment and said, you know, even if it's there, it's unlikely to harm a consumer because the population's low and it's not going to grow in a frozen product. Well, we've had outbreaks associated with frozen vegetables and frozen ice cream. And so, you know, that risk might be greater than you assume. What if you're making dry or ready to eat foods? Again, the assumption here is the organism doesn't grow in a dry food, um, but is there risk associated with that? There is, right? We don't live in a zero risk world. And if you're selling ingredients, for example, to other food manufacturers, we're seeing more and more of those brand owners expecting you to test for Listeria on your finished product. And so that means you now have an obligation to consider better control measures for Listeria, even in dry foods and ingredients. The last one is you've got a history of test results that you don't have a Listeria problem. And I will address this one right at the end of the presentation because this is one I haven't really contemplated much until I had a customer ask me, hey, Doug, I think we have a problem. We've been testing Listeria for a year and we haven't found it. What's going on? So, interesting question. All right, sampling frequency. So, you know, when you set up your routine sampling program, you're pulling samples to be able to answer the question, is my environment under control or out of control? And obviously we have limited budgets, so we're making judgment calls on how much risk we're willing to assume if we're doing a few number of samples and we're testing infrequently. But when you get an out of spec or your indicators are saying your processes are getting out of control, it's time for you to open up the checkbook and start doing investigational monitoring. So on this slide, it's just a list of some commonly occurring things that can happen that can elevate your risk of having Listeria out of control. And so when that happens, I think you have an obligation to make absolutely sure that these excursions from normal practices don't lead to an out of control situation in your facility. So everybody has seen a table like this more than once, I hope. But you know, the question is, how often should you sample? And again, it depends. So if you're high risk and you want to protect your brand, then maybe doing testing on a more frequent basis makes sense for you. Okay. So maybe in your food contact surface zone ones, that's where you would, I would argue, it would make intuitive sense to do the bulk of your testing because that's how foods is likely to get contaminated. With Listeria on a zone one surface. Okay, as you go down the risk ranking of your zones, meaning farther away from exposed food, I think it does make sense to do testing less frequently in those areas because they're lower risk. Okay? And the two bullet items I want you to consider is your test frequency bookends. You know, when you're doing sanitation verification testing, you're doing it once a week, then you could argue if there's a recall situation that you can limit the size of your recall to a week's worth of production. Obviously, if you do it daily, you might be able to argue we only need to recall a day's worth of production. If you're doing testing monthly, your risk that you're taking is you're going to have to recall a month's worth of supply, and the associated bad PR that's going to occur when you send out press releases that say, out of further abundance of caution, we're recalling a gigantic list of SKUs. So that's also part of your risk analysis, is what is your appetite for recall size? So again, the longer your frequency, the potentially larger the size of your recall. Next question is, how many EMP samples should I take? Well, I work for a testing laboratory. I would be highly motivated to encourage you to do a ton of testing. Great, Doug, thanks for the advice. But that's not always what I would do, because maybe your risk doesn't justify doing a large number of samples. So again, it varies on your risk, size and complexity of your facility, yada, 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 yada. So again, I would ask you to consider is your sample size should be related to the risk in your facility. Many years ago, there were trade associations and government agencies that would make recommendations on the number of samples you should be taking whenever you do an environmental monitoring. And the main problem with that is they don't take into account risk. Really, these calculations are just based on the size of the facility. So larger facilities, you should take more samples to get coverage of that larger footprint. Nothing wrong with that approach. It's a good place to get started to answer the question, how many samples should I take? But you also need to put in a risk variable in that calculation. So here is a very simple calculation that the pharmaceutical industry used to use to qualify a pharmaceutical production room for manufacturing. And it's just based on the size of the room. So the equation is the number of samples equals the square root of the processing area in square meters. So I've given you an example here of a processing area. So this would exclude things like employee welfare areas, offices, and warehouses. So this is just where the food is being manufactured. So if you take a workroom that's 40 feet by 60 feet, that's about 220 square meters. You take the square root of that, it comes up with 15. Voila, you should be taking 15 samples. But again, the issue with this calculation is it doesn't take risk into account. I still use this when I do consults with my customers because this gives me just a number by which to compare what the company is actually doing. So if you're a low risk manufacturer, then I can easily see I could come to a recommendation that 15 samples per event would be too many. If you're a greater risk food manufacturer, then maybe you're not able to get full coverage, particularly when you have a lot of physical plant issues, and 15 samples may not be enough for a processing area this size. So again, this is not a recommendation, it's a guesstimation, and use that number to help guide you on what you're doing. So if anybody tells you, if they use this equation, that you're doing too few samples, you know, that's an opportunity for you to educate that individual on what your risk is and what you're willing to accept. Where to test? Obviously, testing your greatest risk surfaces makes a lot of intuitive sense. And some companies spend the bulk of their testing on zone 3 and zone 4 areas. I'll be honest with you, that makes no sense to me at all. Why would you ignore your greatest risk surfaces? Meaning your food product contact surfaces and areas adjacent to those food product contact surfaces. So if you've got evidence that says testing the floors over there in the corner of the facility is the best place for me to spend my testing budget, then I would love to hear your argument, because it doesn't make any sense to me. All right, so again, your product contact surfaces should be a major part of your routine, and people are afraid to do that because if you find Listeria or you find Listeria monocytogenes there, then there is a greater risk of forcing yourself into a recall. The idea here is if you're testing a food contact surface, you find Listeria there, the argument is it's likely that the Listeria on that surface also made it into the food that ran across that surface. So don't be afraid of zone 1 testing, but to reduce your fear, we always encourage you to test for an indicator on those surfaces. And that indicator, I believe, can, should, must include Listeria species. So when you look at FDA's Listeria control guidance document, they absolutely tell you zone 1 surfaces are fair game and you should be testing those for Listeria species. FSIS, with the big blow up in their issues last year with Listeria, I'm pretty sure they're going to start expecting food manufacturers of ready-to-eat meat products to be testing zone 1 surfaces also for Listeria. So a rotation schedule should be developed. Make sure you're getting all of the parts of the facility as part of your program. And the last item here is compositing and pooling is not recommended. And I'll give you an example why I put this recommendation in these public-facing programs a little bit later in today's talk. What kind of samples? You need to be aware that your products and ingredients can be a source of Listeria that are getting into the environment. And companies get caught with their pants down because they say, well, I get a product spec sheet for my ingredient supplier that says there's no Listeria in the ingredient. So you're managing that risk for this one by a piece of paper from a supplier that says, yeah, we don't have Listeria there. I would ask you to consider, where did that statement come from? Where's the verification proof that the lot that you received has been tested by the supplier for the presence of Listeria? So that, to me, is a big gap in many people's food safety plan, is they just believe that their supplier, with that documentation, has in fact taken care of Listeria. And I've been in facilities where they were chasing Listeria all over the place for a couple of years, couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And it wound up being from an ingredient supplier that was providing them with a ready-to-eat ingredient that was being added to their product after the kill step. So that's where it was coming from. They just failed to investigate that. All right, food contact surfaces, obviously, we just talked about that. Also consider some other environmental things to consider. So air, so if you've got HVAC systems blowing air, if those units are sitting outside, they can get condensation, they can harbor Listeria and just pick up Listeria and blow it through the facility. You've got water use, both in terms of cleaning and sanitation, but also might be an ingredient. So consider what the potential is of these two environmental factors as a source of Listeria in your facility. Let's turn now to method selection and data collection. So, I put this slide up. You've seen other Listeria webinars I've done. This is a familiar one for you. But I put the first bullet item up here, don't make it harder than it has to be. And I almost regret putting that one in there because that might be interpreted, I just need to go out and poke a surface and then I'm done. But really what I'm thinking here is, you could have these very, very complicated sampling schemes that, and I see these with some regularity, that number one, don't make much sense to me. And number two, they're impossible for the people in the plant to follow. So it usually comes from corporate and it's just this very, very complicated sampling scheme. So just be aware that, just because it's complicated doesn't make it good. So sample for the types of product in the room, select appropriate equipment. So I put here raw and process. I've seen some Listeria control plans that spend half of their testing budget testing the raw side of their process for Listeria. Again, that might be okay for you to do, but it just seems like a waste of money because you're constantly going to get hits and then you're going to have to do something about it. So, if you're testing the raw side of your process, what is the reason why you're testing? Use appropriate equipment that's appropriate to do the sampling. So again, the two primary items are going to be swabs, which are good for nooks and cranny sites, and sponges, which are good for large surface areas. Been into facilities that have been chasing Listeria and all they're using are these little swab sticks, and they're really not capable of picking up adherent Listeria from some places. They're good for nooks and crannies, so bolt holes, cracks in the floors, gaps between pieces of equipment. But to use those for large sampling areas, I mean, it's just a lot of strokes without a lot of friction, because you do that and they bend, they break, the material on the tip degrades, and now you're adding this foreign material perhaps to your product. Sponges are better for large surface area sites. You can use more friction to be able to pull these adherent microorganisms up off of those surfaces. You can use scrapers. I've used spoons, I've used knives to be able to actually physically remove adherent material, whether it's food product from chain conveyor belts or biofilm from a site that's been resistant to cleaning and sanitation. You can just scrape that crud off and test that crud. Key points for sample collection. Make sure your sampling individual doesn't cross-contaminate the specimen collection device, because you're going to be chasing the wrong direction when that sample comes back out of spec. Make sure you get the samples to the lab. I've had some customers that say, we freeze our samples and only send those in once a week. Well, freezing is a good way to, number one, preserve microorganisms, but in the process of freezing, you will also kill off some microorganisms. So, if you do this practice, just be aware that you're potentially compromising your results. Another item for you to consider is if you are sampling right after sanitation and you're using a no rinse quat, for example, that sampling device is going to pick up some of that residual sanitizer. And once it gets in the presence of the water in the sampling sponge or swab and the microbes there, you can actually kill off Listeria in the sampling device because of the presence of that residue. So make sure you're matching the carrier buffer with the sanitizer residue in your facility. So these buffers will have different inactivating agents that will inactivate that sanitizer residue on the sponge or the swab. If you're manufacturing products and that residue that's remaining on surfaces has antimicrobial activity, so things like antimicrobial spices, for example, then once those get hydrated, they can kill off your microorganisms. So in that case, you might want to consider using dry sponges or dry swabs. Let's see, we talked about this for a second. So you can just look through this and think about how it affects your facility. Be aware that we are in a situation where there is a limited supply of sponges. And the reason is because the manufacturers have a production problem on their hands. So I've had many opportunities to help customers who can't get access to these sampling devices maybe modify their program a little bit, still have some robustness in it, but reduce the number of samples and the number of tests they're doing. So if you're in that situation where you're having trouble getting these sampling devices, let your local Eurofins customer service representative know and see if we can help you out. All right, what to test for? So again, historically, when you have a wet processing environment, so that's either wet manufacturing, certainly wet cleaning and sanitation, you've got an environment that is very good for the habitation of Listeria in that facility. So again, when you think about wet processing environments, we're really trying to control Listeria monocytogenes, and we spend the bulk of our money on testing for Listeria species because if you have an environment that has Listeria species, the argument is that environment is also conducive to harbor Listeria monocytogenes. If you're doing dry processing, then your target is usually Salmonella or Chronobacter, depending on the product. Your indicators can vary. We don't have really great indicators for the presence of Salmonella, but EBAC and coliform counts are typically used. What about Listeria in a dry environment? Well, if that's the product you're producing and you have a customer expectation to test for Listeria, then you have to do that. Okay. So at the end of the day, Salmonella can be a problem in a wet environment, but if you're controlling Listeria, the odds are good you're controlling Salmonella, S-Pex, and everybody else. This one I'm pretty passionate about, and it's I hear my colleagues in the industry say otherwise. So we have some robust debates in public spaces sometime on this. But let me give you my thinking on this and see if you agree or disagree. I don't care. It's your business. You run it. But we do a lot of indicators of sanitation efficacy. So you just do visual assessment to make sure that surfaces are clean. And I've been in facilities where visual assessment passes, but there's visual as evidence of soils and surfaces. And I challenge them on this. I say, this should not pass. And the answer I often get is, this is the best we can do. So if you are not removing soils completely from your surfaces, then your sanitizer is not going to work. And if your sanitizer doesn't work, Listeria is not going to be under control. A lot of people use ATP to measure cleanliness. That's a cleanliness indicator. And what typically happens is the record of this testing is simply pass or fail. So you have a relative light unit spec limit of, say, 50. If it's 50 or lower, it passes. If it's above 50, it fails. And all you see on the data record sheet is pass, fail, pass, fail. And what happens when you get a failure is that actually isn't put on the record sheet because you have to re-clean it until it passes. So what actually is shown on the record sheet is a pass, even though you might have had multiple ATP failures. That is a lost piece of information that can be extremely valuable to you when you're doing root cause analysis. And then if you're doing other quantitative indicators, just failing to plot those out, to do historical trend tracking. Because the value is if your RLUs are going up, or your aerobic plate counts are going up, or your EBAC counts are going up, whatever your indicators are, that's telling you that your process is getting out of control. It gives you an opportunity to ask questions, to start interventions before you ever have an out-of-spec result that can lead to a formal CAPA report. So use these data because they take the pulse of your facility every day when you're doing it. Okay? I'm also a firm believer that high indicator counts can correlate with increased opportunities to detect Listeria. And again, if you find Listeria, it suggests your environment is potentially out of control for monocytogenes. So bottom line is companies that fail to exploit all of this data that you're collecting on a regular basis means you could have an out of control situation that could have been prevented several days or even weeks earlier. All right, a few comments on where to test. Gridding out the facility is helpful. because you can then randomly select which grid you're going to test. Here's an opportunity cost that some people fail to embrace. If you know you have equipment or areas that are difficult to clean and sanitize, wouldn't you want to do more regular testing of those sites rather than just put them on a random grid and wait 9 months before that site pops up to do the testing? So again, use your brain and think about managing your risk. If you know you have high risk locations, I certainly would advocate testing those more frequently. I've had some people argue with me rather vociferously at times that we do end product testing for Listeria monocytogenes. So why do I need to do environmental monitoring? And of course, usually the reason why they do end product testing is because they have a customer that expects them to do so. Well, here's one of the reasons why that can leave a gap in your food safety plan. So if you get a hit when you do an end product test, what that result is telling you that your food safety plan is a failure. What it will not tell you is where in the food safety plan you had an out of control situation. So for example, these bullet items detail what some potential root causes are. So a supplier verification failure. So you had a supplier give you Listeria contaminated ingredients. You had a GMP failure. Well, all kinds of things could fall into this basket. Physical plant defects, personal hygienic failures. You've got a sanitation failure. You don't know when you just have a lot test that's out of spec. You could have a critical process control. Maybe your times and temperatures of your cook step were inadequately controlled. So the other thing that is important to understand is the odds of finding an out of spec lot due to environmental contamination is very low. Meaning you could have environmental contamination, but that 25-gram sample that you're pulling out of that production lot and sending to the lab for testing, most likely it's going to come back in spec, even though the lot is contaminated. For example, the analytical methods that we use in the laboratory assume that there's uniform prevalence of the target analyte, in this case it's Listeria, in the production lot. So let's say this big square is a production lot, and the smaller squares are individual 25-gram portions that you could randomly remove from the production lot. So in this case, in this scenario, each dash represents where you have Listeria. This example, this would be a grossly contaminated lot. However, the odds of you picking that 25-gram sample that has Listeria is actually quite low. You could also consider this big square as your manufacturing room, and each square could be a grid in that manufacturing room where you're going on a hunting mission to find Listeria. So again, depending where you sample, the odds of you finding Listeria when you've got a gross out of control situation like this is not very good. And that's why doing more sampling increases your odds of winning the I found Listeria lottery. Now then, if most of your processes are under control and Listeria cell floated in from the heavens and dropped into product or dropped onto a food contact surface, what are the odds when you randomly pull a sample or two, you'll find it? So the odds are really low when you have a low prevalence of Listeria. And I hear people take this piece of evidence and say, well, this is why testing is a waste of money. Because for me to find this, I would have to do a whole bunch of testing that costs a whole bunch of money, and all I get are negative results back from the lab. Fair argument, but it should not be used to argue we should do no testing whatsoever. So I'll give you an example. This morning I woke up, I looked at my face in the mirror and I said, "Hey, Doug, you're alive today. Congratulations." So if that's the only piece of evidence that I have that suggests that the body Doug is in good shape today, think about all of the other tests I could have done to be able to get a better answer to how's my day going to be. So I could do blood tests, I could do lung capacity, I could measure my girth and see how my weight loss program is doing. All of these other tests could give me much more information on the health of old Unky Dougie today than just me looking at myself in the mirror. Now then, let's say you've got a grossly contaminated environment. So here you have a pretty high population size, but that population is not uniformly distributed. So in this case, you could have a piece of equipment that's a harbored site, and you're actually growing Listeria in that harbored site, and occasionally it may be getting out of its production environment. So if you have these two hotspots, but you're only collecting 5 samples when you do your routine monitoring, how many weeks, months, years will it be before you find these two harbored sites? Could be a long time before they show up in your testing. All right, data interpretation. What kinds of things should you be doing with your data? I'm not going to go into details, but these are just best practices for you to bring your data to life because it tells your story on whether or not you have Listeria under control or out of control. Trend tracking is important if you're doing pass or fail on your ATP, if you're doing presence or absence on a pathogen test or an indicator test. This is a way that you can trend track those data by simply giving a binomial number to the result. So in this case, I give a 0 to a negative test result or an in-spec result. I give a 1 to a positive or an out-of-spec test result. And in this scenario, you've got 8 locations that are tested weekly. Which locations were out of spec? You look for the ones. You could look how the sanitation crew did that day and get a percent pass or a percent failure. In this case, I've got percent failure rate. And it just allows you to see how you're doing over time with your Listeria control programs. I want to spend a few minutes on source tracking because this is a testing tool that a lot of people don't exploit, and I think they should. But really what you're trying to do is if you look at if you build a heat map, and I'll show you an example here in a second, and you plot every place you found your Listeria, it allows you to visually see where you potentially have in control areas and out of control areas. What it doesn't tell you is where did that Listeria come from in that location that was hot. So I'll just visualize this for you. So here's a schematic of a processed meat manufacturer. So you've got the raw side on the bottom, you've got cooking side in the middle, and in the top you've got your packaging line. Okay. So if you do a heat map, each red dot is where Listeria was found in the environment. And if this is all the data you had, you would be inclined to think, well, the wall there on the left and on the hallway, that seems like there might be a harbored site there along the wall. But I would caution you, that's also a high traffic area. And so those Listeria that you're finding there might have just been transported from from a harbored site and deposited along that hallway. So just keep that in mind. The other thing that you see here is you've got some raw product Listeria. That makes sense. But if you go up to the top and look at your packaging line, you've got 3 hot spots on a zone 1 area. Where did those 3 come from? So if you do strain typing or strain tracking, here's the same map, but different colors on the hot areas allow you to see where different strains are residing in the facility. So let's go back to the wall. You see 3 light blue dots, and you go back into the product exposure area. You see 1 blue dot there by the weighing table. So maybe that blue dot by the weighing table has been picked up by transit through the hallway. The dark blue dots, again, high-risk product exposure area before final package closure by the multivac. Where did that reside? Maybe it came from the floor or a piece of equipment in the cooking room, and you can see that cluster around that spot. The raw product ones did get into the cooking area, and so what could happen there. So anyway, you have a lot more information just by strain tracking your isolates, and helps you do root cause and corrective actions better. So the next 3 slides, I'm not going to go into those, these are just for your information, but it allows you to do a lot of more advanced ways to get your processes back under control. Okay. All right, I want to spend some time on issues that we have an inordinate number of conversations with our customers about, and that's a non-confirmable positive. So your detection platform, you get a presumptive detection for Listeria or Listeria monocytogenes. And some customers say, okay, I want you to confirm whether that is a true positive, if you will, or a false positive. And so then the laboratory takes that enrichment and they try and do culture confirmation, and it fails to culture confirm. So what does that mean? Does that mean that Listeria was not originally present in that location? Not necessarily. So that creates a dilemma. There are many food manufacturers that will go ahead and ship product based on a non-confirmable positive. And their argument is, hey, if I don't have evidence of live Listeria, I'm going to presume that it came from dead cell DNA detection. So we wanted to address this problem. So we did a big scientific study to see what we could do about it. So we had a host company that allowed us to spend a lot of time in their facility and collect a lot of environmental samples. Okay? And we did this over a 5-month period. We followed a standard enrichment procedure, and we did PCR screening using 2 predominant platforms that are in the marketplace, and that would be Bax Listeria as well as Backgene Listeria, so 2 relatively similar PCR platforms. But we also treated the samples with pre-Razor DNAs to degrade dead cell DNA. Okay? And our confirmation protocol was the following. I'm not going to go into these details. They'll be in the slide deck for you. And oftentimes when we do this, if we have a dirty sample, these are 2 plates that are pure cultures. That's very rare we see that when we're doing culture confirmation. We'll see a lot of other microbes growing on these isolation plates. So oftentimes it's difficult for the technician to pick a Listeria-like colony off of these plates. And if they can't do that, then there's nothing for them to confirm. So that's one of the leading causes of non-culturable data results. We also used MDS Listeria to be able to go back and retest positive enrichments by either Bax or Backgene. We also went back to enrichments and did whole genome sequencing to just confirm whether or not there was Listeria DNA in that enrichment. Okay, when we had culture confirmation failure, we did what we call some extraordinary confirmation protocols. Again, this is a listing of the techniques that we tried to really try and find that Listeria. So what were the results? So the presumptive positive rate from both techniques was about 7 to 10%. The sample culture confirmation rate was about 80%. So what that means is the non-confirmation rate was about 20% for both platforms. So again, we took those 20% of non-culturable enrichments, and we tried these things. So all our alternative culture confirmation efforts did not yield a colony that we could confirm. Boo-hoo. The secondary platform tests. So there were 13 of 15 back gene non-confirmables that were also positive by either BAX or MDS. So that suggests that these detection platforms were all uniformly sensitive and finding Listeria. When we did whole genome sequencing, 15 of the 15 back gene non-confirmables had Listeria DNA in the enrichment, but those were very low number of reads compared to all the background microflora that was also in that enrichment. And again, their assumption is that background microflora prevents culture confirmation. So just be aware that those really aren't false positives. Listeria was present, and it was just an artifact of the confirmation tools that made it impossible to do a culture confirmation. Okay? And because we were using pre-Razor DNAs, we don't believe that those presumptive positives were due to dead cell DNA. So what can we do about this? Well, we need better culture confirmation methods. There are some service providers that do very short incubation times to be able to get a quick turnaround time on a Listeria result. My assumption is their detection rate's going to be much lower than if you actually followed the validated methods. And if we can do something to reduce the background microflora, I believe we'll do a better job in getting positive culture confirmation. And then from practical confirmations, companies that ship product based on a non-confirmable PCR detection, I think are taking a unreasonable risk in shipping product, but that's their decision, not mine. We also discovered that because the company was finding Listeria in their environment, they began getting better control over it. And when they did that, then not only did they control Listeria, they were controlling all the other microflora that was in the environment. And so the culture confirmation rates went up over time in that company. So I would just ask you to consider, why would you want to do culture confirmation at all when this is a problem with the testing? All right, I want to finish this up here in the short amount of time we have and address the question that doesn't occur often to me, but it's important for you to consider, is if you have infrequent findings of Listeria, does that mean you have the world's best food safety plan? Maybe, maybe not. I've heard of some examples where the food safety team gets a performance bonus every quarter you don't find pathogens. Well, that's a disincentive to finding pathogens if ever there was one. You're not using sensitive methods. There are platforms on the marketplace that have higher LODs than some of the PCR platforms. That means you're going to potentially miss finding Listeria in the environment because you're using a method that's not best in class. Again, I talked about short enrichment times, collecting too few samples, not testing often enough, not looking where Listeria is going to be found, and not testing at the right time are all potential examples. I've heard, I don't know if it's true, but if FDA looks at your records and you're not finding Listeria, they think you might be cooking the books. They might be thinking you don't have a very robust environmental monitoring plan. Again, transient Listeria is going to occasionally come in the facility, and you should occasionally find those. Doesn't mean you have Listeria out of control, it just means you've got a testing program that works. Do you have a defective EMP plan? So again, these are some examples. We'll talk about compositing in a second. And again, I think just not looking hard enough is one that I see frequently. Let's talk quickly about compositing here for a second, and I just want to address a wet pooling concept and go through some of the inevitable math. So in this case, you've got 5 environmental samples. You enrich each one, but you pull a small aliquot out of each one, and you pool those in a test tube. usually a very small volume, and then you run one reaction. So the idea here is you're trying to save money on testing. And again, if it's not detected, then you ship the lot. If it's detected, then you can go back and run individual detections to figure out where Listeria is. So you've got 5 different locations, but only one test result doesn't tell you where Listeria can be. So this is the conventional way of doing it. Well, let's look at the math. So if you're pooling, now you're doing a 1 to 5 dilution if one of those samples is positive, okay? Limited detection of the methods is around 1,000 cells. So, this is a 1 to 5 dilution. So that could reduce your pool population down to 200 cells. If you test that, you get increased odds you won't find Listeria because it's below the limited detection of the method. Okay? That means you would be shipping a contaminated lot with that result. Let's think about you have a really successful enrichment. Let's say you're up to 10,000 cells. You do that pooling protocol. Now you have a population of around 2,000. Your LOD is 1,000. Are you going to detect it or are you not? Depends where that small portion is pulled from that pooled test tube. So for pooling to work, the enrichments must have a target population greater than 100 times the LOD. And if you're doing short enrichment times, maybe you're not getting up to 10,000 cells in that enrichment. How often does this happen? Nobody knows, but here are some examples where it could happen. You're fooling the method. Here are some things I've seen people do in order to increase the odds they'll get a non-detect. I would just ask you, don't do this, because that demonstrates that you are not a prudent manufacturer, and it might demonstrate you're either being negligent or you're being fraudulent. So don't put yourself at risk if you're doing